Function of Character, Plot, and Setting by McGuire. So first, family supper. I chose the question, how do characters in these stories allow readers to explore a range of values, beliefs, assumptions, biases, and cultural norms represented by these characters? So first, the father's values. He values character, principle, respect, and honor. Some evidence for this is, in fact, the story didn't end there. He said, after the firm's collapse, Watanabe killed himself. He didn't wish to live with the disgrace. I see. We were partners for 17 years, a man of principle and honor. I respected him very much. He sighed, a fine man, a man of principle. So some insights that we can take from this is he values strong principle and honor, obviously when he's describing Watanabe and what he did back from like almost the roots of what Japanese believe in. He found it very honorable. But I find it a bit odd that he compares a man that committed suicide, and later we find that he killed his family, to having also strong principles, respect, and honor. And so this can be possibly related back to the samurai, and he obviously values Japanese tradition, and samurai was a huge part of Japanese history. So he possibly has high respect for Watanabe for is very similar to the samurai situation for when they feel ashamed they kill themselves. Also, he seems envious and holds great respect for Watanabe through his description of what he did and also what he values in him. And lastly, the father also has disgrace with family leaving him and his firm closing as well. And so he could also feel ashamed in the need to possibly kill himself in the samurai and Watanabe way. Also, the father values family. Some evidence for this is, if you wish to stay here, I mean here in this house, you would be very welcome to. That is, if you don't mind living with an old man. Thank you, I'll have to think about it. Further evidence is, that seems odd. I said, you're always so busy. Too busy, perhaps. He looked at me with a small smile. Perhaps I should have been a more attentive father. And lastly, it says, this house is too large for a man to live in alone. My father said, I don't have much use for all these rooms now. So some analysis that we can see from this is he obviously still loves his son, but he doesn't really want to admit that he needs his family back. He's obviously very lonely with his situation, but he doesn't just bluntly tell his son, I need you to come back home, but he's kind of beating around the bush and coming up with excuses as if, for example, like there's too many rooms in this house, and he's very awkward about it. But really what he wants is, his son to come home because he's very lonely with his wife dying and, no family with him. And so he's kind of wishing things were different. And so he obviously values family a lot, but he doesn't explicitly really tell his son that he really misses him, which is something that his father just doesn't do, and some insight into what possibly the father truly wants. Next, what the narrative values is change away from the Japanese culture or tradition to more modern ways. Some evidence of this is, surely I said eventually my mother didn't expect me to live here forever. And then some change away from war was, but in an airplane, well, there was always the final weapon. He put the model back onto the table. I don't suppose you believe in war? Not particularly. So obviously he does not particularly believe in traditions and principles, which is quite different from the father. In Asian culture, typically the son and daughter take care of the elderly and their parents, and that's usually how it goes. But both of the son and daughter left, which probably disgraced the father and mother greatly. And he also does not believe in war. Again, not believing in Japanese culture and principles, and possibly suicide and those ideas that the father holds so greatly. Next, what the father's some beliefs is what Watanabe did was a bad thing. Some evidence for this was, my father lowered his eyes and nodded. For some moments he seemed in deep thought. Watanabe was very devoted to his work. He said at last the collapse of the firm was a great blow to him. I fear it must have weakened his judgment. Do you think what he did was a mistake? Why, of course. Do you see otherwise? So I see from this is, did he really mean what he said? Because why would he ask his son if it was a mistake or not, if he's trying to maybe reassure himself of what he did was truly a bad thing or not? But he does explicitly say it was a bad thing, so possibly it could mean he could be truthful in this. Some assumptions he makes is his son will surely go back to America. He brings this up twice. His scene when, it must feel strange for you being back in Japan. Yes, it is a little strange. Already perhaps you regret leaving America. Furthermore, it says, but of course, said my father, this house is so dreary now, you'll no doubt return to America before long. So you can see he brought up multiple times that his son will surely go back. Has little faith in his son staying with him, and possibly reassuring himself of his choice of poisoning his family, for he knows in the end both of his son and daughter will leave him, leaving him no choice but in his mind to commit suicide due to the shame, possibly. And lastly, some biases was against foreigners. Negative connotation believes heavily in the roots of Japan and the principles that should be held. So some evidence was, will you go back into business again? I said, I am in retirement. I'm too old to involve myself in new ventures now. Business these days has become so difficult, dealing with foreigners, doing things their way. I don't understand how we've come to this. Neither did Watanabe. He's a fine man, a man of principle. So we see here that he finds Western people difficult to work with and maybe has a negative opinion of them, some biases towards them. And so because his son lived with them and lived in California, he might hold a grudge against his son for possibly almost betraying Japan and betraying against his roots and his principles that he should hold but doesn't. Next, family supper. The second question is, how do elements of setting not only depict time and place, but also convey values associated with that setting? So fish and traditions, some evidence of involving this is until stricter regulations were imposed, it was all the rage to perform the hazardous gutting operation in one's own kitchen, then to invite neighbors and friends around for the feast. So, and then furthermore as well, that wasn't all. He took his whole family with him, his wife and his 2 little girls. So on the first piece of evidence, it's important to prepare the fish in your own kitchen, and because the family is back together at the house, possibly it has deeper meaning that the father can fully go into the tradition of Japanese to do it in your own kitchen, and which the father is able to now that the family's all back together. Next, his father saw Watanabe as having principle and character similar to the samurai, and they're back in Japan, and so obviously the father feels at home here. And next, character and principle involved with Japanese culture. As I said this quote before, but another take to it was back in Japan, tradition seems to stick with the father, and so if he talks of suicide and actually committing it and being open to it, he obviously doesn't see it as a bad thing. And so again, this is, I know samurai comes up a lot here, but the samurai would kill themselves if they felt ashamed, and so obviously the father feels ashamed that his family left him. So an important part of why this story took place in Japan. Lastly, California and the betrayal. I was living in California. My relationship with my parents had become somewhat strained around that period, and consequently I did not learn of the circumstances surrounding her death until I returned to Tokyo 2 years later. Dealing with foreigners, doing things their way, I don't understand how we've come to this. Neither did Watanabe. And then lastly, but of course, this house is a jury now. You'll no doubt return to America before long. So obviously there's a lot of tension between the father and the son about going back to America. And when the son left Japan, I feel like the father may have felt that he left tradition and principle behind with him. And then again, as said before, father does not like the Western culture very much. And so maybe he wants to end things in Japanese style when you're ashamed or have done wrong, and that is suicide. And so this is his way of also giving his son the opportunity to get back his Japanese roots. Sony's Blues. How do characters in these stories allow readers to explore a range of values, beliefs, assumptions, biases, and cultural norms represented by these characters? So first, the narrator's values. He values Sony, or it can be seen as siblings. Some evidence for this was, I was trying to remember everything I'd heard about dope addiction, and I couldn't help watching Sony for signs. I wasn't doing it out of malice. I was trying to find out something about my brother. I was dying to hear him tell me he was safe. Furthermore, I didn't want to believe that I'd ever see my brother go down, coming to nothing, all that light in his face gone out. In the condition I'd already seen so many others. And lastly, one Saturday afternoon, when Sony had been living with us, or anyway been in our house for nearly 2 weeks, I found myself wandering aimlessly about the living room, drinking from a can of beer and trying to work up the courage to search Sony's room. So some things that we can see from this is siblings play an important role in life, and so obviously they will always care for you, and this is some insight that we can see from this story. And also, at what point is it too far in helping? And that's in quotations, because is it right to search Sony's room for possibly heroin or other drugs, and would that be an invasion of privacy that could further detriment their relationship, or is it actually okay to do that because you're helping? That's some insight that the reader is able to explore through their relationship. And then lastly, the narrator values escaping drugs or helping others do so. So evidence for this is, all at once something inside gave and threatened to come pouring out of me. I didn't hate him anymore. I felt that in another moment I'd start crying like a child. Sure, I said, don't sweat. I looked at my wallet and I didn't have $1. I only had 5. Here, I said, that hold you? So he's growing up in Harlem, and so obviously he understands the pain and the difficulty it is for them, so he has sympathy for them, and he's also trying to help others escape this problem that is so prominent in Harlem. And so, yeah, so this was a touching moment that he were able to see an insight into how he's trying to also help others escape. Next, what Sony values, he values music. Some evidence for this is when she was singing before and Sony abruptly, her voice reminded me for a minute of what heroin feels like sometimes. When it's in your veins, it makes you feel sort of warm and cool at the same time. Furthermore, here I was in Sony's world, or rather his kingdom. Here it was, not even questioned that his veins bore royal blood. And lastly, then they all gathered in Sony, around Sony, and Sony played. Every now and again, one of them seemed to say Amen. Sony's fingers filled the air with life, his life. So some analysis is insight into how music affects his life and how it actually probably helped him get out of his addiction, and also the impacts he has on African American culture and how he's almost described as a king. And so it's obviously others value what he plays, and he values it a lot as well. And it's almost their way of fighting for equality and getting back, having a voice in Harlem and even like the world. And so their way of fighting back was probably mainly expression of oneself through music. And so that's what Sony really valued in this short story. Some biases that we could see was drugs are toxic and you would want to die if you did them. That was the narrator's biases, and some evidence for this is, tell me, I said it last, why does he want to die? He must want to die. He's killing himself. Why does he want to die? And also, but there's no need, I said, trying to laugh, is there, in killing yourself? And so obviously he brings up multiple times that heroin, there's no reason to do it except if you want to kill yourself. And so it's obviously very important to him that, or some biases that he has, is that, yeah, he doesn't really understand why someone would ever do drugs other than if they're depressed or they feel like dying. And lastly, the father's biases. He has a prejudice towards white people. Some evidence for this is, till the day he died, he weren't sure, but that every white man he saw was the man that killed his brother. So he's holding a grudge against basically all white people, and he's skeptical of them and not really trusting of them. So that was one of the father's biases due to the circumstance of his brother being killed by a white man. The cultural norms that we see is the black neighborhoods. So he turned back to the window looking out, all that hatred down there, he said, all that hatred and misery and love, it's a wonder it doesn't blow the avenue apart. So this is kind of showing the struggle it was growing up in Harlem and trying to escape the poverty and drugs so many are caught up in. And then also the fight for equality. Some evidence is, I seem to hear with what burning he made it his, with what burning he had yet to make it ours, how we could cease laminating, freedom lurking around us, and I understood at last that he could help us to be free if we would listen, that he would never be free until we did. So music was a means of them expressing themselves and using music as a voice in getting equality, almost fighting back. And then some assumptions that were also talked about last in the previous slides, with drugs means you're suicidal, but that has already been discussed. Next, how do elements of setting not only depict time and place, but also convey values associated with that setting? So the neighborhood setting, I'll just read a little bit of this, but houses exactly like the houses of our past, yet dominated the landscape. Boys exactly like boys we once had been found themselves smothering in these houses, came down into the streets of our light and air, and found themselves encircled by disaster. Some escaped the trap, most did. So this really displays how Harlem is corrupt and is very difficult to grow up in, and helps audience envision the struggle it was for Sony and the narrator to really escape. Sony obviously struggled more, and the narrator possibly did escape because now he's a teacher. It's hard to escape the disadvantage they have, being African American, being in a rough neighborhood such as Harlem, and then the drugs and violence that come with that. And then the young kids are engrossed in the difficult living conditions even from a young age. And so it describes the playground as not being a place for kids to play, but more a place to hang out after dark. So obviously, the writer chose this setting to really depict how difficult it was growing up in Harlem and the struggle it was for them to almost have equality in this world. And lastly, the other setting was the bar setting. Here I was in Sony's world, or rather his kingdom. Here it was not even questioned that his veins bore royal blood. And also, I saw the moonlit road where my father's brother died, and it brought something else back to me and carried me past it. I saw my little girl again, and felt Isabel's tears again, and felt my own tears begin to rise. And I was yet aware that this was only a moment, that the world waited outside, as hungry as a tiger, and that trouble stretched above us longer than the sky. So music is being able to be express the pain they feel in Harlem, and jazz music was playing in the bar, and jazz was generally coming from African American culture. It was actually invented by them, and so possibly this was their main voice in Harlem, at least for Sony it was, and so that's why the bar setting was very important because it was the heart of the problem. And then Sony is also described as a king, almost like leading a kingdom to fight for equality. It could be almost represented as that, and that's why the setting was depicted as at a bar where so that's where his kingdom was. Music again was the voice in this world for fighting back. And then lastly, music's their great emotion, inspiring change. And so playing music that inspired equality in Harlem was of great significance because Harlem was really the heart of where the problem was in America with African Americans and white people. And so the equality and discrimination were the greatest there. And so this really held a big significance because Sony was able to express himself through music and have a voice in this world to hopefully fight for equality and through his music, and then help others listen as well and inspire change. And that's why the setting was so important.